What if the story you have been watching for years was never actually about love or family, but about survival and control? And what if the moment that exposes everything is not a dramatic argument on camera, but a quiet financial move made when no one is looking, because over the past few weeks something surfaced that sent shockwaves through the Sister Wives fanbase, and it is not speculation or gossip. It is a documented financial decision that raises serious questions about what is really happening behind the scenes and why now. Because when Kody and Robyn Brown quietly secured a $750,000 equity line against their home, it signaled something far more serious than routine money management and moves like this do not happen when people feel secure. They happen when pressure is closing in and options are narrowing, and the timing of this decision feels almost impossible to ignore. For years, Kody Brown positioned himself as the confident patriarch, a man who claimed to have a long-term plan for his plural family, and even as marriages dissolved and relationships fractured, he repeatedly insisted that finances were under control, that sacrifices were being made for the greater good, and that everything would eventually stabilize. But stability does not look like borrowing $750,000 against your primary residence, especially at a time when interest rates are high, the housing market is uncertain, and income streams tied to reality television are anything but guaranteed. And this is where the disconnect becomes impossible to ignore, because the story being told on screen no longer aligns with the actions being taken off-screen. One of the most important details that often gets overlooked is how deeply intertwined money and marriage were in the Brown family, because for years income from the show and other ventures was shared across multiple households. And while that system had flaws, it also spread risk. But as relationships ended, that financial web collapsed inward, and suddenly the cost of maintaining a lifestyle that was once supported by many fell on very few. And Robyn, as Kody's only legal wife, became financially entangled with him in a way the other women never were, and that distinction matters now more than ever, because legal marriage means legal responsibility, and when debts rise, there is no separation between whose problem it is. Public records revealed that this equity line was not a small buffer or a modest loan, it was a substantial amount. That suggests a need for immediate access to large sums of cash, and while home equity lines are sometimes used for renovations or investments, there has been no visible major construction, no announced business expansion, and no clear explanation offered to fans. And silence in situations like this only fuels concern, because when people are confident, they explain, and when they are under strain, they retreat, and the lack of transparency surrounding this move has caused many longtime viewers to start asking uncomfortable questions about whether the Browns are facing financial strain far more severe than they have ever admitted. This is the moment where the tension starts to build, because money problems rarely exist in isolation. They are often tied to legal disputes, ongoing obligations, and emotional stress. And the Brown family has no shortage of unresolved issues, especially when it comes to property ownership and asset division following the breakdown of multiple marriages. And while not all details are public, it is well known that properties were purchased under complex arrangements involving different wives at different times, and untangling those agreements is rarely simple or cheap, and legal costs alone can drain savings at an alarming rate, especially when combined with declining income and rising expenses. And this is where the story shifts from curiosity to concern, because when a couple borrows heavily against their home, they are essentially betting on the future. They are betting that income will continue, that obligations can be met, and that nothing else will go wrong. And that is a dangerous gamble for anyone, but especially for reality television personalities whose livelihoods depend on public interest and network decisions that are completely outside their control. And if you are still listening at this point, take a second and subscribe, because this story is only beginning to unfold, and the deeper layers reveal far more than a single financial choice. There is also the question of lifestyle, because for years fans have pointed out the contrast between the sacrifices Kody claimed were necessary and the cost of the home he shared with Robyn. Maintaining a large, expensive property comes with ongoing expenses that never stop. Property taxes, insurance, utilities, and maintenance all add up quickly. And when income becomes unstable, those fixed costs become suffocating, and downsizing, while logical, is often resisted by people whose public image is tied to success and control, because selling or scaling back feels like admitting failure. And instead, many choose to borrow, hoping to buy time, and that strategy works only if circumstances improve, and if they do not, the consequences become far more severe. Robyn has often spoken about wanting stability, safety, and unity, but stability built on borrowed money is fragile, and safety tied to debt comes with conditions and the emotional weight of being the last wife standing, while also being legally bound to mounting financial decisions, cannot be underestimated. Because loyalty becomes heavier when there is no longer a shared support system, and pressure like that does not just affect bank accounts, it affects behavior, relationships, and decision-making. And viewers have already noticed changes in tone, defensiveness, and emotional strain over recent seasons that align closely with what financial stress looks like in real life. Before we move forward, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments, because it shapes how the story is understood. Do you think this equity move was a smart, strategic decision, or a sign of desperation? Because the answer changes everything, and in the next part, we are going to dive deeper into the emotional and psychological toll this situation appears to be taking, and how it may explain some of the most controversial behavior viewers have seen lately. And trust me, this is where the tension truly escalates. What makes this situation even more intense is that financial pressure never exists in a vacuum. And when money becomes tight, it begins to expose everything underneath: unresolved resentment, power struggles, fear, and the need to control the narrative. And this is where Kody and Robyn's behavior over the last several seasons starts to look very different when viewed through a financial lens. Because what once appeared to be ego or stubbornness now reads like stress responses from people who feel cornered. And when people feel cornered, they don't simplify, they double down. And that pattern shows up again and again in the way decisions have been made and defended. Publicity has repeatedly framed the collapse of his plural family as a matter of loyalty and respect, but loyalty is easy to demand when resources are abundant, and far more difficult when money is tight and choices have consequences. And as the other wives separated financially and emotionally, Kody lost not just relationships but income, buffers, and shared responsibility. And that loss changes the balance of power, because suddenly the authority he once wielded over a collective no longer exists. And instead of adapting, he appeared to cling harder to control. And control often masks fear, especially fear of losing status, security, and identity. And when that fear meets financial strain, it can create explosive tension. Robyn's position in all of this is equally complex, because while she has often been portrayed as protected, she is now more exposed than anyone else, because legal marriage ties her directly to Kody's financial decisions and obligations. And while she has spoken about wanting peace and unity, her body language and emotional responses suggest someone under constant strain and guilt, because being the last wife standing does not come with the victory. Many assume it comes with isolation, scrutiny, and responsibility. And when viewers accuse her of benefiting from the family's collapse, that narrative becomes another emotional burden layered on top of financial angst. One of the most telling signs of financial stress is defensiveness, and we have seen plenty of that. Because whenever money or fairness is questioned, the responses become vague, emotional, or dismissive, and that lack of clarity often signals that the truth is uncomfortable or complicated. And rather than explaining details, people choose to redirect the conversation, and this has only intensified speculation, because audiences are perceptive, and when something does not add up, they notice. And once trust begins to erode, it spreads quickly, especially in a fan base that has followed the same family for over a decade. Another important factor that cannot Being ignored is the changing landscape of reality television. Because networks are increasingly cautious and contracts are shorter, more conditional, and more performance-based than ever before, and shows that rely heavily on conflict eventually reach a point of diminishing returns where the drama becomes repetitive rather than compelling. And if a show's future becomes uncertain, so does the income attached to it. And that uncertainty makes long-term financial planning nearly impossible, and borrowing against a home in that environment becomes a high-risk move because there is no guarantee the future income needed to service that debt will materialize. This is where the emotional tension starts to feel almost suffocating. Because imagine living day to day, knowing that your financial stability depends on audience interest, public sympathy, and a network decision you cannot control, and that kind of pressure changes how people behave. It affects relationships, communication, and even self-perception, and viewers have seen moments where Kody appears overwhelmed, angry, or detached, and moments where Robyn seems tearful, anxious, or exhausted, and while editing can exaggerate emotions, it cannot fabricate patterns. And the pattern here aligns closely with people under sustained financial and emotional stress. At this point, I want you to pause and think about something and then drop your thoughts in the comments because it matters. Do you think the public backlash toward Kody and Robyn has contributed to their financial situation, or do you believe the financial strain existed first and shaped their behavior? Because that cause and effect question sits at the heart of this entire story, and understanding it changes how responsibility is assigned and how sympathy is extended. And if you are finding yourself more invested than you expected, share this with someone who watches the show. Because this conversation is bigger than one couple. It speaks to how fame, pressure, and money intersect in very real ways. As the pressure builds, the need to maintain appearances becomes stronger, and that often leads to decisions that prioritize short-term relief over long-term stability, and accessing a large equity line provides immediate cash. But it also creates a ticking clock because interest accumulates, expectations follow, and repayment becomes unavoidable, and that looming obligation adds another layer of stress that never fully goes away. And this is where many people begin to feel trapped because every option seems to carry risk. And every delay makes the eventual reckoning heavier. What makes this even more tense is that Robyn has repeatedly emphasized the importance of home as a symbol of safety and permanence. And when that symbol becomes collateral, it changes its meaning entirely. Because a home is no longer just a refuge, it becomes a financial instrument subject to market forces and legal conditions, and that shift can be emotionally devastating, especially for someone who values security as deeply as she claims to. And that internal conflict may explain why her emotional responses have appeared increasingly raw and unguarded, because when the ground beneath you feels unstable, it becomes harder to maintain composure. As we move closer to the final part of this story, the stakes become clearer because this is no longer just about one loan or one season of a show. It is about whether Kody and Robyn can adapt to a reality where control is limited, resources are strained, and public opinion is no longer on their side. And if they cannot, the consequences will extend far beyond finances. And before we go any further, make sure you are subscribed, because the final part connects all of these threads and explores what this decision could mean for their future in ways most people have not considered. Yet, everything about this moment signals that Kody and Robyn are standing at a point of no return. Because once a home equity line of this size is open, the illusion of stability disappears and is replaced by a reality governed by deadlines, interest, and obligation. And this is where borrowed money becomes more than a financial tool. It becomes a psychological weight that never fully lifts, because every month that passes, the pressure quietly grows, and that pressure changes how people think, how they react, and how they justify decisions to themselves and to others. And for a couple whose public identity has always revolved around authority, certainty, and control, this shift is especially destabilizing because it exposes vulnerability in the one place they tried hardest to protect. The uncomfortable truth is that This move ties their future not just to income, but to consistency and relevance. And those are two things reality television can never promise long-term because public interest shifts quickly and narratives expire, and when that happens, contracts shrink or disappear entirely, and the Browns are no longer the novelty they once were. Because the plural structure that defined the show has collapsed, and what remains is a fractured aftermath that does not offer the same long-term storytelling appeal. And that reality makes this equity line feel less like a strategic investment and more like a gamble that depends on forces completely outside their control. There is also the reality of age and timing, because rebuilding financially becomes harder later in life, especially when choices are constrained by public perception and limited career flexibility. And while some reality stars successfully pivot, many do not, because their identity becomes too closely tied to one narrative. And when that narrative ends, so do the opportunities attached to it. And that makes this decision feel heavier, because it is not happening at the beginning of a journey, but near what could be the end of one, and borrowing at this stage suggests urgency rather than optimism. Robyn's role in this moment cannot be separated from the emotional symbolism of home, because for her, home has always represented safety, belonging, and permanence, and using that home as collateral fundamentally changes its meaning. Because it is no longer just a refuge, it becomes leverage, and leverage can be lost. And that awareness does not fade into the background, it sits quietly in the mind, influencing every argument, every sleepless night, and every difficult conversation. And viewers have already noticed how much more fragile and emotionally exposed she appears. And that fragility makes sense when you consider what is at stake and how much responsibility now rests on her shoulders. For Kody, this situation confronts him with the one thing he has resisted most: accountability. Because leadership without results feels hollow, and authority without security breeds resentment. And when circumstances expose that gap, people often respond by tightening control or rewriting the narrative rather than admitting missteps, and we have seen signs of that repeatedly, as blame shifts and explanations become circular and defensive. And the equity move only sharpens that tension, because it contradicts claims of foresight and financial prudence, and once contradictions become visible, they linger in the public consciousness, whether addressed or not. What makes this moment especially powerful is that money strips away abstraction and forces consequences into the open. Because emotional conflict can be debated and edited, but debt is concrete and unavoidable. And fans who once argued over fairness or favoritism are now looking at numbers, timelines, and risk, and that changes the tone of the conversation. Because it is no longer about who was right in an argument. It is about whether the foundation itself can hold. And that realization is unsettling, because it suggests that the collapse was not sudden but gradual. And years in the McKinslands at this stage carries its own cost. Because when explanations are not offered, speculation fills the space, and speculation shapes opinion, and opinion drives engagement, and engagement determines longevity. And this feedback loop is unforgiving, and once it turns negative, it becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. And if Kody and Robyn hope to regain trust, transparency may be their only viable path forward, but transparency also requires vulnerability, and vulnerability has never been a comfortable position for them. And that internal resistance may end up costing them more than any loan ever could before this story ends. I want you to pause and really think about this, because it goes beyond entertainment. Do you believe this was a calculated attempt to buy time and regain control, or do you see it as the visible symptom of years of financial and emotional strain finally breaking the surface? Because how you answer that shapes how this entire saga will be remembered, and your perspective matters. So drop it in the comments, because these conversations don't just reflect opinion. They influence how public figures are held accountable. And if you found this analysis valuable, take a moment to like and share it, because it helps keep discussions grounded rather than reactionary. And if you want to stay informed as this situation continues to evolve, make sure you are subscribed, because the next development may not come with a warning, and when it does, it could redefine everything once again.